All right.
Yeah, all
Thank
right.
you. Thank you, Daniel. Happy day, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this Platform Foundation Academy. This is episode 4 on this glorious August, what is it? August 19th. So glad to have you here. It's right there on the screen. I didn't even have to look to the side. I'm your host today, Andrew Barnes, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Daniel. Why don't you give a quick introduction of yourself, Daniel?
Sure. Hey, Andrew. Hello, everyone. Glad to see participants showing up here in our academy. It's always fun to look in like who's turning up today, right? So yeah, my name is Daniel. I'm a colleague of Andrew sitting in the EMEA region in the Zurich area in that team since beginning of the year, but working on the platform for about 10 years or so.
Oh, it's so fantastic to have you on today, Daniel. I'm Andrew Barnes, and I am not in the same area as Daniel. I'm actually on the East Coast of the US, and so excited to be here with you today. I have been on this team even less time than Daniel, but also been working on the platform for about 7 years as a customer, an implementation partner, and at ServiceNow for about 3 years. And a really excited topic today. Last week and the previous week, we were talking about the automated test framework, and you can check those out. If you're watching this live today, you can check those out later in the community YouTube. And if you're watching this on the community YouTube, you can easily jump to that other episode if you so choose. But today we're going to be talking about cloning. Which is a lot of fun. So I'm going to steal the screen share from my friend here, and we're going to get rolling. So if you were here for one of our previous sessions, you may have noticed that the ATF one last week or 2 weeks ago was a little more hands-on. This one is going to be mostly PowerPoint here today, because the concept that we're talking about takes a long time to do. So we're going to mostly talk about cloning today. And if you have questions already burning that you'd like to ask us, please drop those in the Q&A. We'll get to them in text chatting or on the audio live as appropriate and as we can. We've got a couple of polls. Really appreciate it when you answer those polls. But let's dive right into this 4th episode of Platform Academy, talking about cloning. First off, safe harbor. So we may mention some future looking statements that we believe are accurate right now, but you should not make any purchasing decisions based off of the things that we share that are future looking today. So our agenda, real quick, we're going to talk about cloning. So we're going to talk about what cloning is, why you should do it, what are some of the steps to actually implementing cloning, some good practices, some link to documentation for you, and answer the questions. We'll mostly do questions along the way because I like to sprinkle them in the middle, but we'll certainly have a section at the end for that as well. Excuse me. So what is cloning? I think most of the participants here today that are in the live session are aware of what cloning is, but let's level set and really define what cloning is. And at its barest form, cloning is the practice and operation of copying one ServiceNow database to another ServiceNow database. So one ServiceNow instance, be it your production instance, copying that, the data and the metadata configuration. So basically that whole database of that production instance and copying it into another ServiceNow's instance. So that is what cloning is. We'll get into some more of the mechanics and the details of it later. But that's what we mean when we say clone. In this context, is we're cloning whole ServiceNow instances. So some of the definitions of some of the parts of cloning, I want to cover them here so that when we mention them later, you know what I mean. and you can use these in your questions and we'll know what you mean. So every ServiceNow customer has got more than one ServiceNow instance. And so that's where cloning comes into play, is you have more than one instance. At minimal, you'll have 2 ServiceNow instances, and at maximal, you'll have lots. We have some customers with dozens and dozens and dozens of ServiceNow instances. That's okay. Shared data. So when I say shared data in this context, I'm thinking of that core common shared data, like things like the users. So who your users are at your organization are going to be consistent and shared between your ServiceNow instances. So Bob Smith in production is the same Bob Smith in a sub-production instance. And so that's shared data. So that might be location data, it might be user data, groups, that core common data across ServiceNow instances. Source instance. So that is the instance in which we are going to be copying the database up. So that's the originating, that source instance is the one that we want to take that stuff from and then put it in a different ServiceNow instance. And with that, the target instance is the one in which we would like to put data into. So that is the target of our clone, is going to be where we copy that source instance into. Now, when we're talking about copying those databases, there's 2 really important terms that we use, and it's preservers and excluders. And preservers are where we would like to preserve what's in the target instance. An exclusion is where we would like to exclude copying that from the production instance. So we'll get into a little more detail on those and how you use them and how they work together. But that's what the main focus there is exclusion is preventing it from being copied from the source. Preservers is keeping it in the target. Now with that, Daniel, does all of that make sense? Do you think that there's any other definitions that we might need to cover before we dive in?
I think that's a great overview, Andrew. You covered the main points that we need to know when we talk about cloning. Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's dive in then. And I definitely want to see your questions. Cloning can be a little complex. So if you've got a weird edge case or scenario you've run into, even if you've solved it, go ahead and bring it up to us. We'd love to talk about it. So why should I clone? Well, one of those things that I mentioned on the definition screen is one of the reasons why we clone, which is that shared data. So we want that user record, that Bob Smith user record in production, to be the same record entirely in the sub-production instance, because we want it to be the same record and not just superficially the same. We want it to be actually the same record with the same CICD, which is in ServiceNow terms, that globally unique identifier that makes sure that this record is the same, is that CICD. And we use those in places to reference a record. And if they're not the same actual record in between my instances, I'll run into issues when I start promoting my metadata up through my instances. So that shared data is one of the reasons I want to clone. Another reason is, as I note in the first bullet, is when I'm doing my testing of development, I want the test of what I'm going to release into production to be as close as possible as production as I can get. So I want my production -1 instance to be the most similar of my sub-production instances to production, so that my testing of that release is really good. So I have more confidence and less risk when I'm doing my promotions to production. And so I have less operational incidences in production. I want to catch those differences between the instances early and make sure that I resolve them before I get to production if possible. As I said, the development sometimes needs some of those shared resource elements. And when I do, when I reference a group, the assignment group should be this, or the assignment group isn't that. What's stored in that condition builder is the SysID of that group. And while we try and avoid directly using SysIDs of data objects, there's some times in which it's unavoidable. And that's when I need to make sure that that group is the same group. The next time is, we're actively using these ServiceNow instances. So they can start to deviate. I might have done a proof of concept. I might have code that I was working on in my development process that I didn't promote up to production because it didn't fit into my release. There's a lot of reasons why I will have some development and work in a sub-production instance that never makes it up to production. And then I start to deviate. And the more my sub-production instance is deviated, the more likely I will not catch issues that will occur in production. Cloning is a little disruptive. So, when I say that cloning is very important, I also want to caveat that with, but we don't want to do it too often and disrupt too much work. So any thoughts or questions there? Does that all make sense, or why do we clone? Can anyone think of a reason why you should clone that I didn't outline here? And go ahead and share that in the chat. And I'll move on to the next step here, which is, now I know why I should have cloning. Let's start the process of planning to clone. So when I'm going through and looking for, what I'm going to do for a clone, there's some steps that I'm going to do before my clone and some steps I will do after my clone. And so going in order, let's go first with the before stuff, which at the very root, some very fundamental things here that you'll need to do is you need to define what your source instance is and what the target instance or instances will be. Most of the time, your source instance is going to be your production instance. It's not always the case, but it's a pretty good general rule that your production instance is going to be that source instance for most of your regular cloning, because we want our development and testing and UAT environments to be as similar to production as we can most of the time. And so that's why the source is typically going to be my production instance. You'll want to, define a time and schedule for the clone. So cloning can be a little disruptive, and we're going to talk about how to mitigate some of that disruption in a bit, but it is a disruptive process. So we need to figure out a time for our organization that is best suited for when to perform this clone. For some of my previous organizations, this was going to be in a low development time. So if you've got a geo-specific team, say you're all on the East Coast of the US, like I am, you would choose some hours that aren't typically your development time. And you want to take into account not just your developers, but any of those stakeholders that are using those instances. So that's why on the next bullet, I talk about defining who those stakeholders are, because those are the folks that will be impacted during that disruption. And so you want to take into account when's best for them. So maybe my testing team is actually, on the West Coast, or even in a whole different geography. Maybe my testers are in Australia. I need to take that into account when they're using that instance and find that minimal impact time. It might be on a weekend, it might be at a night, but I want to look at that. and plan my clone time appropriately to be the least disruptive. Then once you know what the target instance is and what the source instance is, you need to define what data you want to move from the source instance to the target instance and what data in the target instance you actually want to keep. And so that's a little bit more about those preservers and excluders that we talked about earlier. We'll even get in, drill in just a little bit more to that right now, which is those aren't necessarily going to be the same for all of your target instances. So I may have some scenarios in which the things I want to keep on my target instance might be different between some of my sub-production instances. So you can set up those clone profiles. So there's a capability in ServiceNow called clone profiles, which you can establish these rules into a profile, and you can have more than one profile. And so I could have a different profile for two different instances. So I might have two profiles for my 8 sub-production instances, and some uses one and some uses the other. And that's okay. Another case, so those instance specific things, it can be a variety of cases. It can be that I might have confidential data there in production that I don't want to have exposed to some of the users of a particular sub-production instance. And in that case, I will want to, handle that either through not copying it over or obfuscating it afterwards. So I've got some choices there, but that's one of the reasons that I might want to have some specific preservers and exclusion between those instances.
That's a great point that you mentioned, Andrew, that we got one question there in the Q&A here on how to protect this kind of sensitive data. Will you go into more details as we talk about exclusions and preservers?
Sure, certainly can. So I think I have another slide on it, but let's talk about it right now, which is you've got a couple of options, and they may be appropriate in different scenarios. So one of the options is if you have sensitive data. So for example, if you've got some pay data, you've got some HR salary based data in a table in production, and in your development instance, you don't want to have that data. One of the things you can do is, unless you need it for some reason, some of that data, you can exclude that whole table that is storing that from moving down into your sub-production instance. Another option, other than just purely excluding it, is you can include it, so you can keep it, but then you can obfuscate it in that sub-production instance. And so I'm going to talk about this on the next slide. Some of the after steps is after the clone's performed, you can do some activities on the instance, automated or manual, which will do things like a post clone script can go through and jumble up data like salary data for you. So you could define a script to inspect a table and a field on that table, and change all of the numbers around. You can manipulate that data, so you still have records and you still have much of the linkages you need in order to modify that application. But the actual real data is obscured from you because you've jumbled it up with that post cleanup script. So it really just depends on what how sensitive the data is, who the target audience is, and whether or not you need any demo data there or not, or if you need real data but it's obfuscated. So there's lots of layers and complexities that you can deal with this data during that after stage. So let's roll right into the after stage. So the first step is validate that the clone was successful. But it is actually an important step. So ServiceNow cloning process will notify you if it has an issue that it detected, but you, as the administrator of this clone, should also go and validate that the clone did what you expected. And then you want to perform any of those post-cloning activities, like running those post-clone scripts, which might do some things like obfuscate data or restore some access that would have been removed during the clone, turning off integrations where appropriate, turning off email where appropriate, importing a test data. So if you excluded copying some data from production and you need to bring in some test data to that table, this is when you would do that. So some of those topics are broad and generic because we're handling a lot of different use cases here. And you may need to employ all of these strategies in a complex clone scenario. There definitely are simple clone scenarios where you can just say, yeah, I'm good to go. I can copy all of production to sub-production because it's the same users with the same access in both instances, and I'm good to go. But the scenarios and when you need some more of these complex situations is where you have more developers in your sub-production instance that have elevated privileges there than you do in production, which is fairly common because not all developers should be have elevated privileges in production. As your team size grows and your maturity of your ServiceNow practice grows, that differentiation between those accesses can get extensive. Does that make sense? I can't hear you, Daniel, if you were talking, sir.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I was just telling you, yeah, you're obviously speaking to me. There's nobody else on audio, right?
Yeah.
Following chat, following you is a bit tricky that I need to learn.
It is a little tricky. So do we have any good questions right now?
Well, we have a good tip and a related question to that. And I think you mentioned that a clone will take the backup, the last finished backup of the instance, right? So and the tip here from Dorian is talk to your ServiceNow team via support and figure out when your backup runs, right? They can give you a time frame. They will not say it's like 3:30 a.m., but it's like between 2 and 6 a.m., something like that. You'll get a time frame. As this is all automated and that's deterministic, but you at least get the time frame and you can schedule your clones just after the time frame to make sure you get the latest backup that just happened. Right?
That's a really good tip. If you want to go and check that yourself, if you start the scheduling process, it will actually show you which backup it's going to use with the timestamp there. So
if it's already done, right?
Well, no, it'll show you one. It'll show you the last one that was completed. So you'll get an idea of when the backups are done when you schedule it. So you can start to schedule a clone just to see when the backups are. That's an easy way to check when your backups are, is start the process of scheduling a clone, see when the backup time is, and then you can just cancel that clone. And now you know roughly when your clone when your backup is typically done.
That's even smarter than me asking support, right? You self-service.
Yeah, I like self-service. So it does show you that there. That does point out, I don't think I did mention that yet, but that's the mechanics of, part of the mechanics of how the clone is actually performed is it is done based off of a backup of the source instance. So it is not copying live from your source instance to your target instance. It's actually the last completed backup. In our document
on that, can we somehow force it to do a current clone, not a last backup clone? Can we force it? I know we had some options in the past, but I think they have gone away, right?
Right. So if you want, so no, you can't do live ever cloning. But what you can do is you can't self-service this, but if you reach out to high support and put in a request, you can say, I would like to take a clone at this time, or a backup, an immediate backup, and perform the clone as soon as the backup is done. That can be done, but that will certainly extend the clone period because the actual cloning won't start until the backup is completed. So that is a scenario that you can do, is ask for a point in time backup and perform the clone from that. But support has to help you set up that cloning process. Whereas with the nightly, daily recurring backup, you can perform a self-service clone from that yourself.
Oh, that's also new to me, that we can have an in-time backup. When I was consultant working with support, they always said, no, we don't do that. We have for scheduled ones and you have to wait. But that's great if we have that now.
Yeah, that is an option. So that is in the documents. So I've got a page of documents, and the support page outlines that process in more detail than I'm going to cover here. But you can go read that knowledge article and reach out to support if you so need. So, a little visualization of the actual cloning process is, as I alluded to earlier, you can have that clone profile. Some scenarios you only have one clone profile, but the flexibility there is to have multiple clone profiles. Get that ready, so those preservers ready, and then you schedule that clone process, and then what happens is we go through and define that target instance, adjust any of those preservers or excluders, and then schedule that clone. And the scheduling does, sets up a scheduled job, and handles the cloning process. If you want some more detail of like how the database actually gets copied and those things, that is actually contained in a pretty comprehensive document that I also have in my links, and you can go read up on that. But roughly the process is that backup of the source instance is copied into a new database, and then any of the preserved items from your target database are then moved into that freshly copied database. And then any of the linkages from your ServiceNow infrastructure points to that new database. And then that's the completion of the clone. So now is a good time to drop a little poll into our channel here, which is going to ask.
Come on, start. There we go.
Which is going to ask you how often you do cloning. So if you're the administrator or developer in a ServiceNow instance, go ahead and give us an answer to these poll questions, which is, how often do you clone your development environments? And then how often do you clone that production -1 environment? Because those might be on different schedules. They don't have to be, but it's fairly common for those to be on slightly different schedules. As I said, this is a slightly disruptive action, because I can't do any active development or testing on an instance that is getting cloned, because that work is just about to disappear. So we want to make sure that it's at least disruptive, but we also want to make sure that our releases and our development work produces good applications that we promote to production. So cloning is important, but also we're not going to do it daily. So we've got some options there. It looks like we've got some answers flowing in. I really appreciate y'all answering those. It's actually really helpful to be interactive. Oh, quarterly sounds good, Paige. And let's see, we're a minute and 30 into this poll. We'll start revealing that soon. So one of the reasons I put a fun option in there is I haven't typically had this periodicity, but some customers only do cloning as part of their upgrading process. So the upgrade process is a very important time in which you should do cloning. And maybe at some point we'll talk about upgrades, but there is a lot of documentation on upgrade checklists and how to look through those. But cloning is a very important part of that upgrade process. And my general suggested practice there is clone your production instance into one of those sub-production instances, run your tests, perform the upgrade in that order, and then run your test after the upgrade. If you do it in that order, you get a very nice before and after process for your testing. And then if you have enough instances, performing a clone right before you do your production upgrade can be handy to resolve any of those incidents that come in after your upgrade that say, oh, well, this is a problem because of the upgrade. And you can validate that in the before upgrade recently cloned instance and actually decide whether or not that was an upgrade issue or not. We got a little tangential there, but I like talking about upgrades as well. So we are looking at our poll results, and it looks like Quarterly has won the cake for development environments, and then Quarterly is also takes the lead in the production -1. Now, for me, Quarterly for development, roughly right for me. I encourage you to get that production -1 a little more often than Quarterly. And the reason for that is back, on those earlier slides, I really, I mean this wholeheartedly. The closer that production -1 instance is to production, the better your testing and validation is going to be, the less production incidents you're going to have. Ooh, juggling instances and incident today is a little tongue twister for me. What do you think about that? Are any of you Quarterly folks encouraged a little bit to try and do that? From what will it take to convince you to move those Quarterly down to say monthly for that production -1?
I think the good question is, what is holding you up of doing it more frequently, right? Is it the effort? Is it the time it takes? Is it what else is out there? Make it easier, yeah.
Make it easier. All right. I like making it easier. Do you have ideas on what would make it easier? So if there's something in the product that can be done to update,
clone takes 29 hours. That is a massive number. And I've seen customers where it takes a long time. Not knowing your environment though, I would recommend to have a look with support on what is taking so much time, because even really large instances should be able to clone within a couple hours, right? Not 29, maybe not 2, maybe not 4, but at least what I've seen, like 9 terabyte large instances being cloned in like 6 hours. So work with your support. There are some screws and stuff they can do, and re-indexing is one. And I know we updated the clone engine so it actually copies indexes instead of re-indexing stuff. So there are ways to improve. If you have your custom outcomes team there or the support team, talk to them and see how they can improve.
All right, so we got some talk about update sets, and I'm going to mention that in a minute. I think I've got a slide on that. If I don't, I'll definitely spend some time on that. So definitely communicate. So this is a little disruptive. So that list of stakeholders, let them know. Give them some advance notice. Let them know when the cloning is going to happen. Be proactive in your communication. Sometimes I can be accused of over communicating, but I think it's valuable. So make sure that you inform any of those stakeholders when the clone's going to happen, any tasks that you expect them to do, and a deadline for their tasks, so that you can make sure that your clone is as smooth as possible. Things to consider when you're doing your cloning is, do you have instance specific data that needs to be retained or restored? So think about that ahead of time. Is, do you have any integrations or credentials or user access that either needs to be retained or restored in that instance? Update sets can be one of those things. The sensitive data that needs to be excluded or anonymized. Think about that ahead of time, prepare for it, test for it, and automate as much as possible. Now let's talk about development work. So the first thing I'll cover is undeployed scopes. So if you're using the application repository, one of the good practices that I provide to our architects here at ServiceNow and folks that go through the Certified Master Architect program is, when you create a new scope and you're using the app repo, go ahead right there, that first day, the first thing you do, go ahead and publish that to the app repo as an empty shell and deploy it right into production as an empty shell. If you have some change process that makes you do that at the next change window, go ahead and follow your change process. But an empty app shell with no users and no metadata in it other than one record in the app table is a pretty low risk deployment. So go ahead and get that item deployed into production as an empty shell, and then you won't run into cloning issues with that in the future. So that's a really important first step. If you want to preserve roles in your sub-production instances, you can do a combo of those exclusion and preservers to handle that use case. For your development work, I should actually look. I think I have a slide on this, but we'll talk about it right now. So I know I made a little slide on update sets. Let's just go look. Yeah, there it is. We did. So we'll go right to here. So back up your dev work. So if we're talking about a developer instance, one of those sub-production developer instances where you're actually building and crafting your ServiceNow applications and modifications, here is a slightly prescriptive but flexible framework for you to use for how to handle that, which is, if you've got completed update sets, go ahead and retrieve those up your stack prior to the backup time. So if your clone is at 10 p.m. and your backup is at 8 p.m., make sure that you retrieve those update sets into that source instance prior to 8 p.m. Don't wait until just before the clone time, because you got to get it in before the backup. I've seen a number of customers not remember that part, and they'll get their clone complete and they'll say, I retrieved those into production, and they did, but it's not in the clone because it wasn't in the backup. So all of those completed ones, retrieve those up the stack and make sure that they're in that source instance. Do any commits to source control and publish to the app repo. So that, if you're using source control or app repo for your development work for a given application, perform that commit and or publish to the app repo so that you have stored all of that development work that you have in flight. Then, if you're using update sets for applications, here's a little process that I like to do, which is create an empty update set, and I'm going to call that my clone batch, I'm going to take all in progress update sets with no parent. So that parent field is empty. I'm going to set their parent field to that brand new clone batch update set I just created. I'm going to export that clone batch. Now this step, it can be done two different ways. You can export it, or you can promote it up your stack as a completed batch. Either of those is fine. But if you're going to promote it up the stack to that source instance, make sure it's before the backup. Same as we talked about before. Then post clone, you import that batch clone, commit it. So you do the preview and commit of that batch. Then for all of those child update sets in that batch, you can go through and unparent them. So the ones that have the clone batch as its parent, just clear that out. And you have two choices now. You can set those back to in progress, or you can leave them completed. And you'll pick up your new work and batch that work together. So there's a couple of choices there. I don't like to set update sets back to in progress, but since these were never retrieved from another instance, it should be okay in this case. Questions about that?
Well, there's a question in terms of, we talked about, or you mentioned the data preservers. Would update sets be a good case for preserving them?
No, I would not do data preservers on update sets. And that's because it's a structured hierarchy, and you need to really make sure you got everything just right. And update sets can commonly get large, and data preservers have a limit on the size that they can be for a particular table. And I think it's in the 5 megabyte range. And you can easily get update set collections in larger development teams that would exceed that fairly quickly.
And I would actually think, if you preserve like the sys update XML table, which is the content of the update set kind of thing, right? You preserve the content, but not the applied changes to the instance, right? So you wouldn't necessarily, let's say you had a script include that was in there. You would track the update set content, but the script include would still come over from your clone. You still have the source version of the script include. So you need to reapply that, which makes it kind of tedious, right?
That's an even better reason that you're so right on. Yeah, preserving the update set doesn't preserve the deployment of that work back into the instance. So that's an even better reason than mine. So no, don't do data preservers on the update set tables in hierarchy. Follow one of these methods. I also don't suggest using the option in the clone profile to preserve the in progress update sets, because it only handles a very small subsection, global ones that are in progress that were created in the last 90 days. And I think that causes more confusion than it would help you. So do the same practice for all of the completed ones and the same practice for all the in progress ones, and you should be set. So I think we pretty well covered the excludes and preserves, but just to remind you again, the things you want to exclude is I don't want to copy this from the source to the target. So I don't want to copy, for example, the incident task table for some reason. I don't want to copy that from the source to the target, so I'm going to exclude that. If I do nothing else, what happens in the target is I get an empty table. If I also want to keep what's in the target, I need to add also a preserver. So if I put a preserver on that incident task table, then I will copy over nothing from the source to the target, and I will keep the target data in the target. There's also another combination in which I only have a preserver. And so what will happen is source will get copied to target, and what's in target will also stay in target. So does that combination of those make sense? Any questions about that or thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question on that early on, and which I tried to answer in chat, but I think you now explained it also in the session, which is great. Like that you have the chance of ending up with an empty table, depending how you send it up. And maybe that's what you want, right? But if you don't want that, you need to be a bit careful on how to use the excludes and the preserves. Maybe as a amendment to that, the preserve is the last step of the clone. So with the preserve, you can actually overwrite data that came from the clone. So if you have certain settings, they would be extracted before the clone happens, and the preserve will bring them back. If it's the same SysID, it will overwrite these records, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we got a little ask to cover it a little bit more. So in my examples, if I do nothing, no excludes, no preserves, my incident task will get copied from source to target, and everything that's in target will be gone. So source and target will be the same if I don't have either records, no excludes and no preserves for incident task. If I have an exclude, then what will happen is I'll have an empty table in target. Yes. If I only have a preserve for incident task, then none of the source will copy over and only the target data will stay as it was before the clone. And then that last and fourth combination is I have both an excluder and a preserver on the same table. What I'll end up with is the production will get copied over, and then the target will also then be copied over in place. And as Daniel said, if there's the same SysID there, the target's data for that record will overwrite the production data. So that should be the 4 different combinations you can have of these.
One question that comes to mind, and I'm not sure if you spoke about it as I was following up on chat and Q&As here. Did you mention how the exclusion when preservers work with our table hierarchies? Let's say you exclude something from incident, which is an inherited table from task or from CMDBs, where we have these hierarchies. Did you talk about that already, or?
I didn't, and I'll be really transparent. There are some rules around those, and I don't remember exactly what they are anymore. But I do know that they're well documented in the documents page in the support docs. So the answer to that is definitely in one of these links, and I think it's in 2 of these links, for what happens in table hierarchy scenarios like that task table and the CMDB tables. And I apologize. I don't want to give you the wrong information. So I'm not going to go with my 80% sure answer, and instead go read it in the documents. There are some really good clone docs.
Yeah, and that's an important piece to consider, at least if you want to exclude or preserve data that is in an inherited table, because essentially an incident record, we have 2 records in the database. We have one on the task table and one on the incident table. If you exclude it from the incident, the task one will still be there, right? So that is kind of the interesting. But go out in these documents and read them up, or check in the community and ask there. They are documented.
So there was a question about cloning and then upgrading from one family to other. The first thing I will say is cloning can go between different versions of ServiceNow, and that's okay. So I can have in my source instance, say I can be on Quebec in my source instance, and currently I might be on Rome in my target instance, and I can clone from that source to target. So I can go both up and down in order of family release, and that is okay.
This important to mention is the clone will make sure the target instance has the same version. So it will up or downgrade as needed.
Yes. When you're actually talking about how you're doing cloning and the upgrade process, won't spend a lot of time talking about that today. I probably sidelined us too much on that already. But when you do your clone and then upgrade from one family to another, and you're reviewing that skip list, yes, you'll want to capture those into an update set and deploy those after you do perform the upgrade in your higher order instances. Yes. Any other questions that we want to cover? I know we've had some really great chat. I haven't been able to catch it all. Anything that you want to highlight, Daniel?
I think the chat was great, and we had that here. There was some chat around source control to get rid of update sets and use source control and app repo. So that was a sidetrack there that we probably will need to follow up in a future session. I teased that we will have one of these. There is open question in terms of, are there a list of common tables that we recommend to preserve or to exclude for the other sake? This is something that we can.
So we ship some common tables, and in one of those docs, the support docs, it has a couple of examples of scenarios in which you, so the docs do have some of those listed. A good example is if you want to preserve users and roles, it lists out all of the relevant tables that you'll need to either provide exclusions or preservers for in that support doc. So we do have some scenarios outlined there where we list those common tables to solve that common problem.
And then there's a question on a scheduled job. Let me see. Quite often notice that a scheduled job gets disappeared from sys trigger table post cloning, even out of the box ones like SMTP sender. We have found that scheduled jobs stop from execution after clone. Not all, but random. The question is, are we doing something wrong, or what are we doing wrong?
So what I'll tell you is asynchronous jobs during a clone are paused. If you're experiencing issues after the clone has completed and your scheduled jobs aren't running, it might be that it didn't turn that back on and you need to open a support case. But one thing to note is during an upgrade, those scheduled jobs are paused, and I believe that it applies the same for a clone, is they are paused until the completion of the clone.
I think
I know for sure it is for upgrades, and I think it applies the same for clones.
And I think the SMTP sender email, the notification engine, is one of the things we explicitly turn off post clone. Because typically you clone a productive environment where you send notifications around changes, incidents, and whatever. And on the target instance, which is a pre-production, a dev environment, you don't want to send out the same notifications, right? So we explicitly turn it off for you to validate the email settings before you activate them again. So that is a deliberate choice from ServiceNow.
Awesome. So I've stopped the screen share and we want to drop the last poll in here for you real quick for you to give us feedback on how this session is. So we take feedback and we will adjust this to better suit the needs here. So please give us feedback. Was this session valuable? How can we be better? Let us know. If you have a longer form comment that you'd like to do, feel free to, in the next day or two, when this goes into the community and the community YouTube, to put a comment there if you'd like a longer form comment. We're happy to take feedback, but please answer our poll for us. And Daniel, thank you so much for helping with the questions and answering today. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much, everyone, for participating in the chat. I really love to see a lively chat. Cloning is one of those things that once you get right, you stop thinking about it, but getting to that point is not always as smooth as we'd like. So I hope you found this informative and helpful if you're not yet to that cloning nirvana state in your organization yet. And with that, let us go ahead and end the poll, and then we will close for the day today. I'm going to end that poll, share those results real quick. So we got some positive feedback. About right. Will you attend again? Looking good. So we will continue this into episode 5, where Daniel is going to be talking about
Instant scan will be our topic. How you
awesome.
manage and measure the health of your instance inside.
I'm so excited. I love Instant Scan. I want to talk about it. So we'll see you back here in 2 weeks if you're live, and looking forward to it. And if you're watching us, asynchronously, look for a video in what is that? At the end of August for Instant Scan. And have a great day, everybody.
Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.